talking about. Your relationship to it is as important as anything else. In Sudbury, as I said, there was 125 years of mining and smelting, of copper and nickel, which basically poisoned the soil all around it. It became a huge magnet for employment and for immigration. Most of the Anishinaabe people were pushed off the land. And there was some duplicity in the drawing of the boundaries by the Indian agents, so that was actually being contested by the people. They do make money now contracting for timber and a few other things, and some of them work for the smelter or the mine. But their ability to stop the mine is long gone. It's when you organize in resource-dependent communities, there's a number of things that are part of the problem in trying to do any organizing. One is that there's a huge discrepancy between people who have a lot of money and terrible poverty. What mining invariably does is make a gulf between those who work for the mine and those who own the mine. And then the people who don't get those jobs. Almost invariably, there's a bigger spread in wealth. And so a lot of the problems are experienced by single women and children, by youth who can't get jobs, and by elders who have been injured and damaged both by the pollution and the mine. There's a pride about mining. Most miners know that they are sacrificing themselves and willing to sacrifice themselves for their families. And it creates a real problem when you're trying to organize in communities against mining because people don't understand it. Unless there's respect for the sacrifices they've made for their families and to produce metals you need, you'll never get listened to. The culture of mining creates a lack of respect for the services that nature provides and for women. It transforms the culture of communities so that, generally speaking, they're hard drinking, there's lots of booze around, women are treated with real disrespect, and the land is treated with disrespect. Outdoor recreation tends to consist mostly of motorized recreation of different kinds because people can afford it. And the accident rate is often very, very high. So you get drugs, alcohol, recklessness issues. If you look at the stats from Yellowknife or a trail or Sudbury, it's always really bad. People don't want to know that they're living in a polluted environment. There is a culture of denial and fear. And there's actually literature now called Cultures of Contamination. And if you're organizing in a community that's already got a mine, it's probably a really good idea to read some of this work by Michael Edelston. People are worried about environmental stigma. If their community gets branded as being a toxic community, they won't be able to sell their house, which is probably, in most cases, the only investment they've got. They don't want to live in a place that's considered environmentally damaged, and they'll fight you on it. And the work we did on the soil study, which I'll talk about a little bit, one of our biggest oppositions came from the local food organization. It was shocking. And then there's issues of regulatory capture. In almost all parts of Canada, monitoring and enforcement is already controlled by the company, and it's incredibly hard to get data to be able to organize or to work with it. When we tried to take on the Sudbury soil study, there was a soil study that sampled the soils around Sudbury, didn't look at things like radon, which are a real issue there too, didn't put together anything except what was supposed to be coming from the smelter over the years. And there were many, many properties that were really, really seriously contaminated. The response of the companies was to set up a multi-stakeholder committee that had to agree by consensus on what was going to be done about these findings, and of course that meant that they controlled it. The union members on the committee were completely lost. The people from the First Nations really came to meetings because they didn't understand what was being talked about. There was a whole range of issues about trying to involve people and talk to them. And the more we went on about it, actually, the harder it became to get people engaged in action. And I don't know that So we actually we've been taking a whole different strategy in Sudbury, which is mostly around trying to transform the culture through community arts, through community organizing with the people who are most disenfranchised, and through various kinds of educational activities. To the extent that that's been successful, I think it's kept another culture alive there and allowed some other things to happen and allowed space for Indigenous people to assert themselves again in Sudbury. A lot of it's led by the Native Friendship Center, the Nisqually Native Friendship Center, and by a group called Myths and Mirrors. And organizing around issues that weren't directly affected to the mine and trying to build a different vision of how you could actually live in that city has turned out to be easier to do and probably more effective. There's such a history of anti-communism, of red baiting and attacks on people that people are living in a state, not I think of apathy, but more of fear. It is a company town. The unions have diminished in size from when I moved there in 1970, when they had almost 30,000 people working as blue-collar workers for Inco and Falconbridge. So I think about 4,000 now between the two of them. The production is the same because they've automated everything. But the unions have taken the brunt of it. There's been a lot of, through the years, there has been an attack on the unions to diminish their power and ability. And they went from being a group that could actually determine policy in the city to being a group that needs everybody's support it can just to hang on. Judith Marshall's here and has worked with that for a long time and probably can provide more information if you need it. The second one I want to talk about, I'm sorry this is so quick, but I did want to sort of give you a snapshot, is the abandoned giant mine in Yellowknife. It operated for 50 years. It produced gold, probably, I don't know how much, but maybe gold enough for a couple of swimming pools. And it did it by roasting the gold and separate it from the arsenic. And the result of it is that there's 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide stored under Yellowknife and Great Slave Lake in the abandoned tunnels of the mine. And arsenic trioxide is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It dissolves in water. And there has been now a number of years of people organizing to do something about this. It's on the land of Yellowknive's Dene. Yellowknive's Dene, it was their bed basket where this mine is. It's poisoned. It will never again be their bed basket. And the arsenic that's stored under there cannot be removed safely because if it starts escaping, it'll poison the workers and poison the community and even more. And so rock isn't solid, it's fractured. So what they've had to do is build a sort of building, a cup, a frost, permafrost around it that will contain it until they figure out what else to do. So for the local organizing, the Dene were for a long time in a complete state of denial about the fact that this couldn't be fixed. I mean, I've been at meetings where the elders were just couldn't believe it, couldn't hear it. The white community has been led by a completely volunteer group that is sort of Yellowknife's local opposition called Alternatives North, with a pit bull of a man named Kevin O'Reilly who heads it up. Kevin helped form Mining Watch Canada precisely because he knew unless there was a national movement to clean up these abandoned mines across the country, they'd get nowhere. And fought, even within Mining Watch, there was resistance to taking on abandoned mines to the extent that Kevin thought it should. Mining Watch worked to form a thing called the National Orphan and Abandoned Mines Initiative with federal and provincial and territorial governments and mining industry and the communities, because we knew that the industry wanted these cleaned up too. They just don't want to pay for it. They're poster children and they make things bad. We brought communities together that had the same problem to talk about what they could do. We had a number of conferences about it. We worked with Kevin on building a campaign around abandoned mines that really got some changes in legislation, but not enough. Kevin and the people from Alternatives North and the Dene ended up having to do enormous amounts of research to understand the baffle gap that was going on in order to not fix this problem. I think the governments wanted to fix it too because they know the consequences of a leak. So it's a different issue when you're dealing with abandoned mines because they're a problem for everybody. They're a problem for industry because if there's something like that spill at Mont Collie a few weeks ago, the industry gets hurt as much as anybody, except, well, the companies don't get hurt, but it affects their prices. The government doesn't want it to happen because it's a political disaster for them, and the communities certainly don't want it to happen. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, it's
I wasn't in Canada when that mine closed down, and so the term abandoned mine, what happened to the company?
The company went belly up. It was owned by a woman named Peggy Whitty.
I remember her.
She owned a number of other companies, and the price of gold was falling. They basically tried to go bankrupt. They didn't end up going bankrupt because she had a tax pool of tax deductions that was bigger than what they owed, and so they just came to agreements over these things. But it was abandoned eventually to the government.
Wow.
So in all these big abandoned mines, a lot of them end up becoming the government's responsibility. And even in Yellowknife, when people were trying to deal with this, they were dealing in the community when they were organizing with environmental stigma issues. People didn't want to have their housing prices drop. They didn't want to have their community branded as a toxic place because they wanted tourists, all those kind of things. So Kevin and the Yellowknives Dene got involved in keeping the community together. They worked nationally. They helped form Mining Watch Canada. They participated in the environmental assessment process for the cleanup. They hired consultants. It went on and on and on. And this week, the federal government has finally approved the plan to at least keep it in place. And the good thing is they're saying that it isn't fixed. This is going to have to be worked on, and we're going to have to find solutions for it. Because permafrost around 230 isn't going to help anybody. So they went to the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board. They spent weeks, and they found experts to help them out. And then the federal government had to approve it, and they've actually won that. The one thing they didn't get that the Yellowknives asked for, and Alternative North asked for, was an apology to the Yellowknives Dene, and that was not granted. The third one I'm going to talk about, I'm going to be brief, was the Raven Underground Coal Mine on Vancouver Island. It's at Fanny Bay. That big red blotch in the bottom corner is the mining leases that the Raven Coal Project took over. They wanted to build an underground coal mine right about 2 kilometers above Fanny Bay, which has the biggest Pacific oyster fishing farm fish in, well, oysters, they farm oysters, on the coast. It's a sustainable fishery. It's been there for 125 years. The oysters are marginal because there's been previous coal mining in the area, so there's a lot of cadmium in them and they can't be sold some places. So the possibilities that this mine was going to destroy an oyster fishery worth $23 million a year, 600 jobs, and the rest of the things that go on there was enormous. The people wanted to stop it. They talked to the First Nations that are there, Comox First Nation and 3 or 4 others, and they were all saying, we'll wait until, and the Fishermen's Association, the Oyster Fishermen's, the Shellfish Association, said they were going to wait till they had the environmental assessment before they made a decision. Now, that's a real mistake. You should never do that. Because you need to say no and force the company and the government to persuade you that it's going to be safe. If you get into the position of waiting for the EA, it may never happen. You're already in trouble. If you can persuade your communities to say no from the beginning, then they're in the position of having to persuade you that it's a good idea. Sometimes you can't do that. The Comox Valley is a home for, who's here? Anybody here from Vancouver Island? Yeah, so you know, Comox Valley is, yeah, the home for many, many retirees from the mainland. And the plan was just to go back, the plan was that they were going to mine the coal there, and then they were going to ship it up over the hump of mountains to Port Alberni and ship it out, turn Port Alberni into a coal port and ship it out from there. Port Alberni is a former lumbering town. And it would poison, the road up there is terrible too. So there'd probably be accidents on the road. They'd probably leach into Fanny Bay and destroy the shellfish fishery. And then at Port Alberni, they would have the effect on sports fishery, on the sustainable Aboriginal fisheries, and probably basically destroy the port. So there was a whole, people were really, really upset about it. And there was an immobilization, again, all volunteer. It was, the guy at the center of it was a man named, God, I'm blanking on his name, John Snyder, who had been an Alaska Teamster and had moved to Comox Valley to retire with his partner, and ended up having to take everything he'd learned as a union organizer into the process of trying to stop this. And then there was a woman who lived in Port Alberni who had retired as the National Communications Coordinator for CAW. And in that valley is full of people who retired with lots and lots of skills, and First Nations who are very sophisticated about their rights and title and what they can do. So they worked to build solidarity across the community. They provided, they set up Coal Watch, which does research and analysis on economics and coal and stuff. It's a great website to check out, and kept people updated. They talked to neighbors, local organizations, local businesses, and local governments to get support. They had a concrete vision of the sustainable economy they wanted for the region in the future. They'd spent 10 years hiring consultants and developing one that didn't include the mine. So that had to be promoted to people. And then they engaged in the process and the proper channels, which took enormous amounts of energy. And it was the first mine that's ever been turned down by the BC government. So it was a huge success. And just to end, if we respected the awesome cost of the minerals we use, and it's a line you can use when you work with people in cities, everything here has a cost in terms of waste and people's lives that is just unbelievable. I think the others will talk about that more. But I think that that's an organizing strategy. It's talking about where that came from. So I'm going to stop there, Ramsey. I think I'm really out of time.
Communities, they've been creating areas that really, not just environmental impacts on water supplies and landscapes and land that communities have used for decades and centuries even, but really tearing apart the social fabric and ways of lives of local Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. I think the silver lining to that has been that those areas of sacrifice have been tremendous catalysts for huge resistance processes in different parts of the region. I'm going to just show a few images from a couple of areas. First, Goldcorp's San Martin mine in the Siria Valley in Honduras. This is a mine that open pit gold mine that used leach pads where they were spraying cyanide on the extracted mineral. That only operated for 7 years, between 2000 and 2007, but in a very short period of time, people in the communities started to see serious health impacts on their health, and evidence of acid mine drainage at the mine, which is a form of contamination of the soil and surrounding water supplies that can persist for decades and even centuries. This conflict in Honduras continues to be unresolved today, but continues to be an important reference point throughout Honduras, and I would say even El Salvador and Guatemala, as an example of why mining should not take place in communities in the region. Another example is Goldcorp's Marlin mine in the northwestern highlands of Guatemala. You see one of the open pits to your left I actually just saw this mine a couple weeks ago, and they're starting to refill it with all the ore that they're now extracting from some underground tunnels that they've been building, in a very risky process that's going to aggravate the potential of those pits to generate acid mine drainage into the future. And to the right, you see an image from Crisante Hernandez's house, one of several hundred homes that have seen this kind of crack form since the mine was installed, which is believed to be connected to the increased transport and explosions around the mine. And a short quote from Crisante, they say, "This is development for San Miguel, but what they're developing are cracked homes and social conflicts." And there, I think, even beyond, again, the changes, the absolute transformation in the landscape, in the serious risks to the water supply. This is a highly seismically active area as well. I think actually some of the elements around the social conflictivity, the lack of respect for indigenous rights, the violence and repression that people have seen, and the incredible impunity that the company enjoys in Guatemala. There was repeat calls from the most prestigious human rights bodies in the world for the suspension of this mine, and for respect for the community's right for free, prior, and informed consent, and for protections for the community's water supply and local health. All of that went unheard, unapplied, and so I think another reason that people use not just the physical impacts, the environmental and social impacts, but the system, the corrupt system in which these companies are operating that ensures impunity for them. And finally, another mine that, this is Goldcorp's Los Filos operation in Guerrero, Mexico, much bigger operation. Goldcorp, Marlin, for those, there's been a lot of films and things around Marlin, so I think maybe some folks here have heard that story. Los Filos is 10 times bigger. There's 2 massive open pits that are only in their second phase of extraction. There's an underground operation. It's been in operation since 2007. It occupies now 80% of the land base of the community of Carrizalillo. And in that short period of time, at least one member of every family has some sort of health deterioration in their health status as a result. They're not able to rely on agricultural production. The production of mezcal has all but disappeared, which was their kind of off-season form of subsistence. And the other major impact in this area is the growing insecurity. In Mexico, we're seeing the growing relationship between organized crime and mining in the country, and mining communities are becoming a target for that. But this has also been an important point of resistance. The community has welcomed to Carrizalillo many delegations from other parts of the country to see that mine, to see the physical impact, to see the reality of what open pit mining is. So while this has been a terrible experience for the people living there, and continues to be, it has also been a reference point for those that are resisting mining at earlier stages. So all of these stories continue to be problems and struggles that are ongoing and that present tremendous challenges for the local communities and their allies that are trying to address the impacts. But they're also incredible reference points for the growing resistance in the region. And this is not my own words, but the best way to avoid harm in the first place is to prohibit that they enter our communities. And that's precisely what folks are trying to do. I would say in Latin America, the strategies now are going earlier and earlier in terms of trying to organize against mining. They're trying to inform and communicate, not even where there's a project developed yet, but rather where there's just a mining concession. So mapping out where these concessions are, informing communities that there's an imminent threat should a company arrive to develop a project there, and trying to take action at very early stages. So we see processes of local information and communication. We see processes of communities organizing what they're calling territories free of mining. And they're doing this depending on the community structure and the framework in which they're organizing, through community assembly decisions, through local consultation processes, both in demanding respect for indigenous rights as well as municipally guaranteed rights, through local statutes and municipal ordinances and locally determined and land use plans. We're seeing communities declare their municipalities, their communities, their ejidos off limits to mining. There's also legal actions that communities are taking that are backed up with social mobilization, knowing that if they don't demonstrate that the legal actions, they might get a favorable decision, but it'll never be applied. And so that you need to maintain considerably organized community in order to have the law be applied in your favor to the extent that it can work in your favor, and also building networks and allies. But beyond the local, just to give an image that people have stopped seeing these as a problem with a mining project. They're seeing this as a problem with a mining model, in which you've got mining concessions that have been granted arbitrarily across literally swaths of national territory. In Mexico, they're talking about some 30% of national territory being concessioned to diverse mining companies. Of the foreign interests, I think about 60% of that are actually Mexican firms. Of the 40% foreign firms, the vast majority, over 70%, are Canadian. I could show you other maps of the swaths of territory in Guatemala and Honduras, in Peru, Colombia. But it's literally large percentages of national territory. And as such, people have also been looking to build national resistance to this as an extractive model that is threatening communities and the well-being of entire peoples. And I think it's significant to see where there's been movements in this direction. So in Guatemala, a recent national public opinion poll showed that there's been 66% of people, including in urban areas, opposed to large-scale industrial mining. There was actually a moratorium on new mining projects that was enacted during the prior government administration. Things have changed quite a bit with the latest. In Honduras, 90% people opposed and in support of the environmental movement against mining. El Salvador, 62% people opposed. There continues to be a moratorium in place that's been enacted through presidential commitment, basically, not through law, since 2008. They did manage to get this into law in Costa Rica, and all over the region we're seeing territories being declared free of mining. I will talk about what's gone on a little bit in terms of the implications of all of this resistance and the current context, which has had serious repercussions, particularly in places like Guatemala and Honduras. And that is that in response to this growing resistance, and this has been a process over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we are seeing increased criminalization, violence, militarization, and stigmatization of these movements in diverse contexts. In Guatemala, under the current government, communities that are in resistance are being increasingly criminalized, thrown in jail, and actually around the newest Canadian mining project in the southeast of that country, they've installed a military intelligence operation to oversee local communities, effectively a form of psychological warfare to try to divide the very broad opposition to the new silver mine that Tahoe Resources, which is a spin-off company from Goldcorp, has just built. So the repercussions for communities all over the region are serious and intensifying. And where whole countries have had some success at spelling off the industry, such as El Salvador, which has had no new mining project in the last 15 years, continues to maintain a moratorium against new mining projects. We see companies using the international arbitration framework that's been installed through free trade agreements to sue those countries, to sort of punish them in that way. Right now, Pacific Rim Mining, now owned by Oceana Gold, which is an Australian-Canadian firm, is suing El Salvador for $301 million in a World Bank arbitration tribunal, and a Calgary-based firm is suing Costa Rica for $94 million after having lost its mining concessions through constitutional court decisions. So the implications have been stark and difficult, and throw up new obstacles besides just the complexities of dealing with industrial mine projects, which in and of themselves are incredibly complicated, and as I think Joan described very well, create incredibly complicated scenarios at the local level in which to organize. So on top of that, you layer on top of that a reinforced pact between governments, including our own, and the industry, and you have a really tough situation. That said, I think there's sort of a series of different areas in which communities and social movements are defining to continue to organize and build their movements, and ways in which we work and can continue to work and strengthen our work in solidarity with them. And I think they break down into a couple of different layers. First, prevention. So that sort of early stage organizing, before there's a company, before there's a project on the land, to defend land, water, territory, diversity, other ways of life, through these forms of declaring territories free of mining, which depend, the way in which you go about that will depend on whether you've got an ejido, whether you're an indigenous community, municipality, depending, and whether you're located in the area of the mine or downstream from the mine. Where you have mine projects already operating, one of the things that some of our Mesoamerican partners have undertaken is trying to do more community-led monitoring to improve the documentation of the harms that have been done, to demand corporate accountability. So getting information, seeing what's going on, and spreading that word as it goes. So like coming back to that point about where there's existing projects, those also serve as important places for other communities to come see what's happened and take that home and inform their communities about that too. And we also have important battles for justice and redress where harm has been done. There's a couple of lawsuits that are ongoing in Canada that I won't get into detail right now, that are just a couple of examples of the way that that's happening. Oops. And, I don't know what that is. And then, and then just finally, I think it's important here that we see ourselves as part of the problem, and the problem is not just one company and not just one project, but it is a model that we've installed here at home through processes of colonialism, through very predatory capitalism, and that we're exporting abroad. It's not that we've got a better thing here, that people need to do things better here and follow the Canadian model. No, we're exporting the Canadian model. That's a problem. We need to be in solidarity with communities here. We need to be in solidarity with communities there, and which creates a complex environment. One of the ways, though, that we've found to try to do some of this work with communities is through coalitions that have strong relationships on the ground, through which we can have a constant flow of communication, information, and strategizing together. Camigua is the Coalition Against Unjust Mining in Guatemala. We have folks that are on the ground all the time that allow us to maintain a relationship. I mean, there's certain capacity to that. There's the need to grow our capacity in these areas all the time, but we found that this is a model that allows for that kind of north-south communication and strategizing. And I think really important to acknowledge the really important work of mining justice groups right now across the country. To talk about groups in Victoria, and Vancouver, and Toronto, and Montreal, and Peterborough, and East Coast. Working in your own organizations, in your own localities, in your own universities and communities to build resistance to the different expressions of this model at home. One example right now we're seeing in Vancouver, this new institute that the Canadian government's installed, the Canadian International Institute for Extractive Industries and Development, which is a front, an academic front, to help further government and industry intervention in resource management policies and institutions abroad. And there's a group of students that are saying no to that institute. And that's just one example. There's a number of examples, I think, depending on where you live, where you could build processes of solidarity and resistance to this model. And I think that's another important way that we can talk about strengthening. So that's what I got.
So this is our community flag, and what it represents or symbolizes is the fact that we signed an adhesion to Treaty Number 9 in our territory, right in our community. And the colors represent the fact that when our people were told that the commitments that were made to our people, the treaty commitments that were made to our people by the Crown, would last for as long as the sun shines, which is the yellow, and as long as the rivers flow, which is the blue, and as long as the grass grows. And that would be the amount of time those commitments that were made to our people to share this land would last, essentially forever. And so because our people are strong believers in a God who created everything that exists around us, looked at the fact that creation was being used to symbolize how long a commitment would last. So that's the significance of our colors. But as it turns out, that treaty agreement, the adhesion to Treaty Number 9 that was signed in July 5, 1929, basically said that we gave up all rights, every part of our land, forever, to His Majesty and His successors, forever. We gave up our birthright. That's what the text of that treaty said. That we have nothing. We decided to just one day give it away and sign everything over to a foreign power that was coming into the territory. But that's not what our elders tell us. Our elders tell us that we're meant to share that territory. Share that territory with the newcomers. Share the benefit of that territory and the resources. However, not understanding the English language, which is foreign language to our people, the text that came out after the signing of the treaty said, we're landless, we have no land. So that's where we have the different understandings on what we do in KI into trying to protect the territory and trying to put forward the idea that KI did not give up the land because our elders tell us. So just to give you an idea on what the background is to who we are as Nunavut and Inuit, we believe that we sign on with another nation, which is the British government, as opposed to Canada and the provinces. That was what our people were led to believe, that this treaty was between two sovereigns, that only sovereigns make treaties on a nation-to-nation basis. But as it turned out, somehow the successor state of Canada got into the picture, along with the creation of a successor state, which are the provinces. And to make a long story short, the land then has been claimed by Ontario, the province of Ontario, that they own the land and resources that we live on, and the Crown, or the federal government, owns the reserved portion of the land that we live on. We don't even own that land that we live on, according to legislation. But we do not believe that. We still fight for that. In 2006, we found an exploration company about to embark on a drilling program about 22 kilometers on the south side of the lake, or of the community. So that would include the lake, as well as, I think it's 40 kilometers, I guess, altogether. And it was at a place called Namexibis, and they were there without our knowledge. We kind of, without our knowledge and consent, and we kind of stumbled on them and told them that they were trespassing and that they had to leave, because we have processes in place. We've had processes in place to try and protect the territory. And one of those was a consultation protocol that we had developed, a 6-step process based on what was coming out of the Supreme Court of Canada, that there is a duty to consult and accommodate. And so that was one of the established mechanisms that we used to try and maintain territorial integrity, to protect the territory. The other thing that we tried to use was the treaty land entitlement process. It's a federal process where there are comprehensive land claims in areas without treaty, and then specific land claims. So we filed a specific claim because we felt that we did not get the actual amount of land we were supposed to get under treaty. So we filed that. So we thought that we were being proactive in trying to ensure that we protect our territory, but our efforts using our consultation protocol and our tree land entitlement got discounted by both levels of government. And as a result of that, they end up sending this company called Platnext to run a drilling program without our knowledge and our consent. And there was a 10-day protest at the site, and they eventually left, but they came back at us and sued us for $10 million. That they had that right to be there. To make I'm just trying to bring out the main points here. As it turned out, we ended up in the court system, in the court process. Of course, we really don't have any money to go through the court process. But the first ruling that we had was in June, was it 2006? It was 2006, right? Yeah, 2006. Yeah. The first ruling said that it was in our favor. It was actually a huge ruling that the judge gave 6 months to try and come up with an agreement, because we did have a consultation protocol in place that was discounted by both the government as well as the company. But to make a long story short, as it turned out, Ontario came on as part of the court process as an intervener, but they were more supporting the company to try and get access to the territory. And as it turned out, I'm not sure how many of you have heard that our leadership ended up being sentenced to 6 months of incarceration by not allowing the company to access the territory, because in October 2007, I believe it was, we left the court process because we could not afford it anymore. We had spent by about $700,000 by that time trying to respond to the ensuing court process that came as a result of being sued, as well as Ontario being involved. But at that point, when we left the courtroom, the judge had to listen to the other side and basically granted them immediate access to the territory, and that we could not stop them. That was the decision in October 2007. So when they tried to come onto the territory, they're met at the airport by the community and told that there was no access, and then they basically had to leave again by the end of the day. It was a long day. There were people standing around at the airport trying to get these guys to go back on the plane. And then as it turned out, we ended up back in court. There was a court hearing in December 2007. I was actually here at that time at the National Gallery of Canada, being recognized for the work that I was doing to try and protect the boreal forest. But at the same time, there was a court case in Thunder Bay where our leadership basically said that, yeah, they were in contempt of the court ruling to allow the company into the territory. And of course, without my knowledge, they said I was in contempt too. And so in December 2007, that was the court process, the court hearing that took place. So in January 2008, I get this call from an Inspector Smiley. He's a detective, Smiley. And he says, I have a warrant for your arrest. He says, but I don't want to exercise this warrant because I know the background to that story. He says, but I just want to know if you're going to attend the court at the end of this month, which was the end of January. And I said, yes, I plan to. I haven't had a chance to speak to this man. So I ended up going to that court hearing, and I said that I am still working on trying to find a lawyer who will represent my interests, because I do intend to challenge this decision, the fact that I was found in contempt, along with what became known as the KI6, which is our chief of council and one of our community members. So from there, my case was then set aside from the KI6. My case was put over to June, sometime June or July, 4 days in June or July of 2008. But the KI6 were sentenced on March 17, 2008. And I remember at the time that my case had been set aside, and I wasn't really getting proper support from my own community, based on the fact that I was doing something else, challenging contempt. So I didn't know how I was going to get to that hearing. There were really interesting things happening around that time, really interesting things that are hard to explain sometimes. Anyway, I stopped off on the side of the road and walked into my place in KI just a week before March 17th came up. And the thought came to me there was going to be a sentencing on Monday. And I said, I wonder if I was supposed to be there. I knew my case had been already moved forward to July, June or July. And then I said, okay, well, I guess if I'm supposed to be there, a way will materialize that I'll get there. And I always talk to God. Ever since I was a young man, I always talk to God and try to ask Him things and basically that people won't see me. I was very shy as a young man, and I looked quite different as a young man. I was born breech, and my head was huge, and I had a scrawny little body, and I looked like a gangly little alien. and people would pick on me because of that. And as a result of that, I'd ask God to please don't let anybody see me. So anyway, just before March 17th, I'm talking to God. I said, well, I'm sure you'll find me a way if you want me to go there. I get this email from a regional organization, an educational organization, saying, we are having an emergency chiefs meeting in Thunder Bay on the 18th and 19th in Thunder Bay. And we were wondering if you could help us out with translation. I do simultaneous translation at meetings, wear my headphones and I speak and translate into our dialect. And then I thought, okay, so 18th and 19th is a special chiefs meeting. The hearing is on the morning at 10 o'clock of the 17th. That means I would have to travel on the 17th to go down to Thunder Bay, but I wouldn't get there till the afternoon of the 17th. So I'd miss the hearing. And I thought, well, that's a little too close. That's a little too close. So I called up this person and I said, I'm available, but when do you need me for? And she says, the chief's meeting is 18th and 19th. And then she says, but the elders want to meet on the 17th. So I'll have to bring you on Saturday. The elders want to meet at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. And they want to stop at 10 o'clock to go to the sentencing. So that's how I ended up at the sentencing and had my way paid there. By the time I got there, we got there late. You could feel the energy. There was so much anger, just different emotions happening in that courtroom. So I asked the person closest to me, I said, what happened? He said, they were just sentenced to 6 months for contempt. And another person came up to me and said, well, they're going to come after you. And I said, okay, that's fine, they'll come after me. And then another person said, good thing you didn't go, otherwise it'd be going in. So, as it turned out, I did my challenge, and we successfully got my contempt set aside. That was the first part of my portion of the challenge. I managed to get a great lawyer, who didn't cost me a cent, by the way, which is another amazing thing that happened. And we got contempt set aside, but the second part of the hearing was supposed to be the upfront cost motion, where we were asking the court to rule that the government has to pay because there was a public interest in the constitutional challenge that we filed, which is the third part of our case. But because, this is my opinion, because they lost the first part of the hearing where contempt was set aside, I was no longer in contempt, they were made to pay $20,600 on that hearing. They didn't want to go into the upfront cost motion hearing because they thought that they might lose and that they would have to pay for the constitutional challenge. And so what ended up happening then was that the KI6 were still in jail. And my lawyer said to me, there's a Court of Appeal hearing coming up in Toronto on May 2008. I can't remember, it was near the end of the month, 26, 27, 28, Joan, I don't know if you remember, around that time. And he said to me, can you sign me over to go represent a regional organization to try and get these guys out of jail? I said, yeah, sure, I can sign you over, you can go over there and get those guys out. And as it turned out, my lawyer, Julian Faulkner, and Sarah Dover, another lawyer, and Kim Murray of the Aboriginal Legal Services in Toronto argued along for the release of the KI6. And so they did 68 days of their 6-month sentence because they were released from the Court of Appeal in May. But one of the things that came out of that ruling was that the court had ruled that there was indeed a duty to negotiate in good faith, to reconcile the Aboriginal interests with competing interests. And it's a ruling that I keep letting people know that there is something that is already established in law, that there is a duty to negotiate in good faith to reconcile the Aboriginal interests with competing interests. And so, based on that, two big things happened after that. One, the provincial government introduced 2 new pieces of legislation. One was to reform the Mining Act, to bring it more up to contemporary standards, and to try to make it respectful to Aboriginal and treaty rights, which are, of course, in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. And the other piece of legislation that they introduced was the Far North Act. And what the Far North Act is supposed to do is to enable community-based land use planning. Communities can do their land use planning, but there have to be, was it 200,000 square kilometers of protected area within those land use plans? So it was not really a real opportunity for communities to do their own planning. They had to have all these rules that govern how they do their land use planning. And as it rolls out today, the whole Far North Act process rolls out like this. You have to agree to work with the province to develop a land use plan. So you have to, they need your agreement to work with them, your consent. And the next thing is you have to develop a terms of reference with the province. And the third thing is you have to have a boundary on where you exercise those terms of reference. But at the end of the day, the minister still decides whether your land use plan is accepted or not. And the way it's working out now is that they're using the dollars from the land use planning process to get communities to buy in to the Far North Act process, which a majority of First Nations did not support when it was read at Queen's Park. There was a huge resistance from a lot of the communities on the Far North Act land use planning process because it did not adequately reflect what the communities had been saying. But on that day, on the day of the third reading, they said that they had First Nations support, when in reality what had happened was they brought in 2 communities from the Ring of Fire area and signed a memorandum of understanding that they would work together. And outside there are at least 30 or so First Nations saying we do not agree with the Far North Act process, piece of legislation. But they went and spun it and said, oh, we have support, we have First Nations support based on the fact that 2 communities that they brought out of the Ring of Fire signed a memorandum of understanding to work with the government. So that was how the Far North Act process was pushed through. So those are the 2 things that happened as a result of the struggle with KI. 2 pieces of legislation were introduced. But also KI also developed further developed, it nationalized the resources under KI. What that means is that we were referring back to the fact that we as a nation signed a treaty with the British government. So we were exercising our nationhood, saying, okay, these resources now belong to KI. So that is what our consultation protocol is. It's now being reviewed by an international lawyer. I don't have a copy of it to share with you at this point. That will happen soon. Okay, so I have 5 minutes, so I'm almost done. Anyway, so we have that, and we have our watershed declaration that will protect the entire watershed, that no type of development will happen within that area without the consent of KI, and KI will ensure that the watershed is protected. So that's where we're at, and those are the interests that have to be reconciled with other competing interests. Those 2 documents that we have put out as KI, the consultation protocol and the watershed declaration, are the interests, our interests, that have to be reconciled. What else is happening now? One of the things that we had to go back to, and this is my final point here, is because we tried to use the established mechanisms of society, which is the treaty land entitlement process, and the consultation process to the Supreme Court ruling that were discounted and rebuffed, we had to go back to our own law, which is Ganoe Ndandake, it's called. Ganoe Ndandake, which means I'm looking after my land and keeping my land. And so we had to say to government, okay, since you will not respect the laws pertaining to our people, here is the law, deal with this one, which is Ganoe Ndandake. And that's where we come from as we develop our own laws, our consultation protocol, that they come from Ganoe Ndandake, which is the spiritual original mandate that was given to Chimek Sibinimo. And that is who we are as a people, that is where we come from, and that is what this thing symbolizes. And that's our story. One point I forgot to make is in March 2012, I believe it was, the provincial government removed 23,000 square kilometers of land in our territory from mining and staking. But one of the things they did not understand or accept is the fact that Ganoe Ndandake, when it was invoked by our people, covered the whole territory, and it was never rescinded. So there is still that conflict that's coming up then, where Ontario removed certain KI lands from mining and staking. So there'll be another struggle with that. And but as far as we're concerned, we never rescinded Ganoe Ndandake, and it still runs in the territory. And we will say the struggle continues. Thank you.
I wanted to just return to a point that Jen made near the end of her presentation about the sort of systems that are perpetuating these injustices. And you mentioned the Institute in British Columbia. I'm wondering if you have some comments about these university corporate partnerships with mining companies. And I'm thinking in particular, I'm a faculty member at the University of Western Ontario, and we're in a process right now of establishing what the university is calling research clusters of excellence. This is under the Ontario government's differentiation framework policy, where they're asking universities to identify sort of key areas. And this process has bypassed collegial self-governance, so it's been done from a very kind of top-down method. And there are 3, we call them the Troika, 3 senior administrators who are making all the decisions about what these research clusters will be. They are keeping a lot of the information secret for proprietary reasons because of the kinds of corporate partnerships that they're making. But we do know that one of the research clusters, and there will probably be 4 or 5, is called Environment and Sustainability. Now that sounds really good, right? But the key corporate partner is Yamana Gold, is a mining company, and the core faculties involved are engineering and science. So there hasn't been very many opportunities for resistance A few senators have spoken out in the Senate about this, but it has actually not gone through the Senate. The decision's being made at the top. So that's kind of our small struggle at Western. I wonder if you have any insights into how this is reverberating at universities across the country and what universities can do to resist these kinds of corporate partnerships with mining companies.
Yeah, specifically with regards to the new institute, and just to preface a little bit, give a little bit of context in terms of the institute that was formed at UBC and SFU, there was a tendering process that the Canadian government put out for $25 million to set up this institute. And so there's a lot of universities that actually bid on it. And it's 3 that are sharing the $25 million. So it's UBC, SFU, and the Polytechnique in Quebec that are going to execute the Canadian International Institute for Extractive Industries and Development. There are 60 strategic partners that are also, to some extent, and it's unclear how formally, that are listed in the agreement, which there was still the Canadian International Development Agency that existed at the time, has now been brought under Department of Foreign Affairs. But a large number of universities in Canada show up as strategic partners of the Institute. And I think it would be, I mean, I don't know what the outcome would be, but just, I think more information in each of the universities that show up as partners, if there were a group of faculty and students that could write a letter to their own trust board or sort of president and copy it to the group in Vancouver and to the director in Vancouver, indicating concern over what this stands for. We've got a short brief on how basically this is mandated by government and industry. The advisory committee to the Institute includes government and industry. It's not an independent academic institute. It doesn't have control over all of its public relations, and its projects are going to be determined in priority based on where there's Canadian economic interests in other countries. And we know that those are being set up and facilitated with the Canadian embassies that now have a 100% mandate to serve corporate interests abroad. So I think there could be at least some public demonstration of concern from different institutes across the country, and that we have a copy of that document. The students at UBC got it, so that's available to be shared, as well as a bit of an assessment of the key points around that. In addition to that, as you say, I mean, I think there's other ways in which this is taking place here at the University of Ottawa. I believe that the Devonshire Initiative, which is an initiative to facilitate corporate partnerships with NGOs in the international extractive sector, was installed here at the University of Ottawa, I understand, on a fairly similarly top-down, closed process in which faculty and students didn't have a whole lot of say in here either, despite concerns about it. And I think there's other ways of corporate capture, too, of our academic spaces across the country that I think would be, deserve a lot more attention and could be a really good focal point for more student and faculty organizing and community organizing, too. I think there's probably a few other comments, but I think the point you raise, and as an opportunity, and I see that institute as quite symbolic of one of the main thrusts, at least of Canadian foreign policy right now, in the extractive industry. So I think it could be a really interesting focal point to support, and there's already a base for organizing in Vancouver. Thank you. Yeah.
John, the best for whatever scenarios. I became actually the president of the Board of Special Inspectors of McGill, which is just a new formed union. So I've looked at the corporate at some point, because I look at the Canadian dollar is actually a resource nation, and we are attracting a lot of companies from all over the world to Canada. And actually McGill and other institutes, if a company comes in and they put $1 or put $1 million, they would put, I don't know how much, and you could have a research chair who would be just doing just that. So the government is in collusion with companies to find out what would be the best methodology. PhD bulletin, Suncor, all of them are doing a fantastic job. They are hands-on academia. And actually, when I teach, I have to be faithful to my future engineers. I graduate some thousands of engineers a year. They need jobs. What kind of jobs? How to extract the minerals. Sir, we have not forgotten the native. And actually, we're becoming very focused on looking at tailing, reclamations of land before we start a project. How much of that barrel of oil or that ounce of gold, how much of that should pay down the pollution that we are creating? We haven't gone in depth of Jane and how to mobilize the local, but I do think what we want to think about. I mean, something very sad about mining, if you do a trip, take an airplane, fly over Canada, it's cradled. We are breaking Canada into holes, just like that's what we've been doing, and it's going to continue like so, because there is money to be made, and we've forgotten what Mother Nature is doing to us. Basically, we want to, education is number one. At top level, we have to be represented at the government level. We have to bring the other community to be partnered with the university. That's where things is happening. The engineers, we try to sensitize them to these issues, but not enough. Environmental impact assessment need to be part of the lingo of this education. How that's going to take place, we need communications and education.
Maybe, could I just make a response to that? I looked at an awful lot of feasibility studies for mining companies, hundreds probably. And there's a few things that could be done that would make those much better. A lot of mining companies shop for the engineering firm that's going to give them the response they want. I know one that went through 5 different ones and kept stopping them because they weren't getting what they wanted. The first is that there's a whole lot of externalized costs that never end up on a company's balance sheet. And the pressure to make sure that they actually estimate properly the reclamation costs and the costs of catastrophic accidents is really important. And it's not done. And that's a requirement that should be there, even from the investor's point of view. Most mines wouldn't be economic if you did it. Secondly, most feasibility studies are based on what they call pre-tax analysis. In fact, those are often the legitimate amounts because most of them don't pay any taxes at all. All mining taxes are based, and income tax are based on profit. Mining companies have a million ways to hide their profits. And if they were done on a proper taxation basis, most of them would not be economic to do. Most of them include huge amounts of subsidies from the federal and provincial government in terms of roads and all sorts of other things. They're never in the feasibility study. And the sensitivity analysis around things like currency, long-term prices and so on is often really bad. So quite frankly, most of the mines that are shown to be feasible these days, if they incorporated all the externalized costs to the communities and the environment, it wouldn't be feasible at all. And I think engineers who do these feasibility studies have a responsibility to the profession and themselves to make sure that these are done honestly and well. And quite frankly, I don't think the profession does that. So I just wanted to put that on the table, and it's good if you're helping that happen.
Thanks to the panel for such interesting presentations, and I can think of a dozen different points that I'd love to jump into, but I want to go back to what John was speaking of. I'm just intrigued about why KI has been able to take up the fight in the way that it has, while many communities have not. And a lot of things that I've been reading about Ring of Fire communities and others throughout the country, I mean, the first reactions in the face of a mining investment seem to be appropriately around land, around water, around environment. But then the sort of siren song of the companies in saying, we will bring you economic growth, we will bring jobs, that many communities then, in the name of jobs for their children, decide that yes, I mean, we may not like some things about this, but we really have to take this on because that's what it promises for our community. Why has KI been able to resist that lure of economic growth and jobs and stick to its guns around other issues? Have you, I mean, it was interesting to hear Joan speak of this community in Comox, which for a variety of reasons, I hope I got the right one, had a whole alternative idea of what the development of that area could and should be, and was able to counter the mine with a whole other sense of this is who we are, this is our land, this is where we want to go. Does KI have that vision to counter the lure of the mining companies, or how does that play itself out?
I think there are a few things that why KI does what KI does. I think one of the things, first things is choice. We talk about the consultation protocol because the land or the law as it currently stands says there is no veto. You cannot say no to a development company. But KI wants the opportunity to say yes or no. And we've engaged on a lot of the right to say no campaigns as part of the struggle. And so when you think about that, having a say in what happens in your territory is a very important thing. To the environmental part of that, where they wanted to do the drilling was in a very environmentally sensitive area. And when they say to us, we need these platinum group metals so we can develop a new fuel cell technology for catalytic converters to lower greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time we need to dig up your territory to do that. It doesn't really ring as something very positive for the community, especially if it's in a very environmentally sensitive area. They would have to have removed huge amounts of overburden to dig at those metals. And it would have gone into the river system, would have come into our lake where we have our food, and then it would have impacted the community downriver. So that's the environmental side of it. Jobs, yes, of course there are jobs, but most of the time workers are bought in because our people are not trained to come and do the jobs. So you cannot really successfully argue, I'll give you all these jobs. The other part to that is when the community tried to deal with them in a fair way, to look at things from a different perspective, a KI perspective, one of the things that the community said, okay, well, in treaty, we said that we agreed to share the land. That means 50-50, okay? So when that was put forth to the company, what they said was, if you want 50% of the profits, you have to put up 50% of the risk. But in the eyes of KI, what they're being asked to do was put up 50% of the cost to dig up the platinum group mills on our territory, plus 100% of the land. So it didn't make economic sense when you think about it. So those are the things that we had to take into consideration when we have to start to decide what happens in our territory. Also, there is no mechanism in place for revenue sharing. There are IBAs, but that is not revenue sharing. If you look at Attawabaska, now that's a community that has a very lucrative diamond mine right next door. People still living in tent frames. So there's really nothing in terms of proper revenue sharing as envisioned by our elders. So those are some of the factors that come to play in resisting something like that. But the overall thing is that choice. We need that choice. We have to provide that consent if things are going to happen in that territory, because it will impact our lives to a great extent.
Woman in the purple, and then we'll...
Jen visiting us on one occasion. But I wanted to talk a little bit about British Columbia and just bring, I think it relates to what you're saying, because really in British Columbia right now, I see us as the province of hope and despair. hope, because of the Silicon case, which really want to emphasize what it's done. Disaster that's happened recently, and this is an egregious act of deregulation, lack of listening to advice that has been on the books for months, if not years. But at the same time, what we're seeing is the response from Indigenous communities like the Tahltan that are blockading another mine, the Red Chris mine, because it's the same company. And there's also another Indigenous community in Tofino that has also press released about resisting Imperial Metal.
I think just making the connection between local mining opposition and international is really important, because this is a collective struggle for human dignity, human health, for the environment. So I really appreciate just that you had this idea, this inspiration. I wanted to just kind of talk about the international side of things. I had the experience to go to Honduras last fall and visit southern Honduras near the border with Nicaragua. A small community called La Masila, which is near the town of El Triunfo. I'm sure you're familiar with that area. It's in the Choluteca department. Basically, it's a town of maybe just over 100 subsistence farmers, and their land has been concessioned for mining, and there's already mines kind of surrounding the region. Gold mines mostly. They use the cyanide method of extraction. Now, as I'm sure you know, the mining law in Honduras is one that's very regressive and says that people can be basically moved off their land without access to a court process to challenge that. And so on top of this, the Honduran government's been revoking licenses for NGOs working in the area, and there have been death threats against community members who are trying to activate the community. So I guess the question I'm getting to is how can Canadians really be in solidarity with threatened communities and do this work from the bottom up, so not really relying on just sending money abroad or relying on foreign NGOs on the ground, but how can communities like this resist the mining with our support?
I'm glad you brought up the example of Honduras, because it's also, I think, important to note that the new mining law was in part paid for and advised on by Canadians. The Canadian International Development Agency provided technical support on that mine, and the Canadian embassies lobbied super hard for it in the aftermath of the coup. Not just to get the mining law in place that would be favorable to the companies, but to lift a 9-year moratorium on new mining projects that had been put into place precisely because of the impacts at the San Martin mine, and knowing that the mining law could not help communities address those issues. So, I mean, Canadian complicity in all of this is absolutely egregious, especially in what's going on in Honduras right now. And so I think, and one thing that's important to know, I'm impressed, as always, in Honduras that communities are still figuring out how to organize, and every month it seems there's another municipality that has held a vote to say, you know what, we don't want mining here. And even though they know that that's not going to stick in terms of law, it's a tool for organizing and very importantly, I think, expressing where they stand. What we can do concretely, and I think what we've been doing sort of in different other countries. Right now, the Honduras Solidarity Network, which is being head up in Honduras by Karen Spring, an activist that's worked for a long time with Rights Action since the time of the coup, is now working for the Global Justice Alliance. There's an idea to form a working group within the Honduras Solidarity Network to look at mining and to form a bit of a bridge between the organizing that's going on at the community level there and organizing going on. The Honduras Solidarity Network right now is particularly strong in the U.S., but I think we need to incorporate more Canadian involvement in that, and it's just kind of a nascent idea. But I think these sorts of coalitions are a way to establish a bridge of constant contact And to organize things like solidarity delegations and to keep in touch in terms of when there's urgent actions because I think urgent actions, especially when folks are at threat, if they're done on time and if there's a rapid response, it can help to deter and dissuade types of violence. In Honduras, some of the types of violence are complicated, especially where there's organized crime involved, because I think those don't respond particularly to any forms of outside pressure. But I think that's one way. I think other ways are getting involved in some of the accompaniment groups that are involved. There's the Honduran Accompaniment Project right now that's providing important on-the-ground support to organizations and local communities that are affected by mining and other projects. And then there's other organizations that have maintained long-term support, like Rights Action and others that do take down educational delegations, and that then form a bridge for doing local organizing here in terms of education work and when there's speaking engagements and that sort of thing. So it's kind of not reinventing the wheel. And then also I think independent media projects and to. On the works, I think there's really brave and important journalists like Sandra Cuff, who I think she's living in Honduras again, through the Media Co-op and other projects that do ongoing reporting that's really important to getting the word out about what's really going on through outlets like Media Co-op, Upside Down World. Those, for us at Mining Watch and others, I think are really important sources of information because you don't get the full story in
I had was for John relative to KI's legal struggle. What was the broader struggle against the project next to your community? What was the outcome relative to the mining exploration that started in 2006? What's become of that?
What has become of that? I guess we're still trying to. As I said just before I ended, the government withdrew the mining and staking a huge portion of our territory without our knowledge, of course. And I think that struggle is continuing in terms of who has jurisdiction on the land. Because as far as we're concerned, we have jurisdiction. Because when you think about that, if you think about the overall struggle, it really was about who has a say, who can allow what happens in their territory. Now, Ontario has always claimed that they have jurisdiction through the treaty, right? The treaty that says we gave up all our land, which our elders tell us we did do. So that struggle then becomes, when we did our struggle, we basically were saying to Ontario, well, show us your proof that you have jurisdiction, right? Show us proof that you can send in a company into the territory. So then, as a result of that, they developed this Far North Act process, which basically, when we look at it through the eyes of KI, tries to legitimize Ontario's claim to jurisdiction. So that struggle is still ongoing. So if Ontario believed that they truly had jurisdiction, why would they need the Far North Act?
John, can I just add something? The government paid out Platinum $5 million to get out. I mean, part of it was that the company was mining for compensation. So when they did this to get the mining company off their back, they paid them for their claims. I just wanted to add that to John's version.
So the company is left and there haven't been operations.
There was another one after that.
Yeah, well, they still have an interest in it for 20 years at a certain type of royalty, if anything should happen on that land. There was another company that came in called God's Lake, and they were bought out for $3 million by the province, even after that happened. And their legal fees, their lawyers, I'm sure all that stuff was covered. The sad part about that is that they're using our lands to leverage compensation, and the community doesn't get anything. So that's the really sad part about it, and that's why I say the struggle still continues to try and assert that issue of jurisdiction throughout the territory. And if you think Ontario remove those lands from staking for the benefit of KI, you have to really think about that again, because Ontario doesn't do anything other than for Ontario.
And mostly what happened is that became such a sore spot within the mining industry that the industry wanted it dealt with, right? Latinx was a renegade in this one. And it was creating all sorts of problems for them in other places they wanted to be. So the government coughed up the money, withdrew the land from staking, and it left the First Nation basically where they had been. I mean, it was as John's saying, it's true, but from the industry point of view, they had come to really resent Latinx. A lot of, across the country, mining for compensation was really common. Maybe not as much now because of the nature of the junior mining industry. It's happened in a lot of places.
But they never compensated KI
No.
all of the time and effort
Nothing.
and sweat and lost work
And anxiety.
and anxiety and stress.
Nothing.
When we were fighting my case, they were saying that we can't file claims on, at least for my portion anyway, and we've asked for at least some apologies. Of course, they're not forthcoming. But we're still there. We've always been there and we'll remain there. And if they want to come, they're welcome to come and talk with us. And my new line has been, we beat you before, we'll beat you again. You might as well come to the table and sit down and talk with us.
For me, I think some of the real take-homes of this session have been the importance of creating a vision for sustainable communities and the importance of those.
So Canada is the base of 75% of the world mining companies. Why all of these companies based here in Canada, and in what ways does the government support them, with subsidies or deregulations?
Canada has this long history of mining. It's there in our DNA. It's just been part of the birth of Canada, Quebec, all parts of the country for since the origins of the country. And over time, I think there's been a high level of expertise that's been developed. And so ultimately, you have now 75% of the world's mining companies being at least capitalized in Canada. So the money for their operations is raised here through the stock markets and so on. But it's because of that history and strength. And so the mining companies, whether you agree with them or not, they're very good at what they do from the investor's point of view. You know, that's why.
How socially responsible are these companies? Are they engaged in exploitation of other nation resources, where the people get nothing and the environment gets destroyed?
Yeah, this of course is controversial, and the cases I know best are in Guatemala and El Salvador. It was mentioned in the presentations the mess that Goldcorp left behind in the Siria Valley in Honduras. If they had cleaned that up, I think a lot of the conflict elsewhere might not have happened. But the fact that they didn't clean it up and got away with not cleaning it up and still get away with it to this day means people have opposed mining in El Salvador and other parts of Guatemala and so on. And the track record of other mining companies in other places isn't very good either. So they always claim that they want to be socially responsible and respectful of communities and so on. But you know, the experience of communities in Guatemala and El Salvador has been absolutely the opposite. El Salvador, we worked with a community that would be affected by a mining company called Pacific Rim, and the government eventually said no to the mining project, and now the company is suing the government, and that just seems not respectful at all of the legal processes in El Salvador, the legislative processes, and the government's right to make decisions for the benefit of the people and the protection of the environment, especially protection of water in El Salvador. The companies ignore that.
Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you.